Nancy Pelosi can't explain why the people got crumbs in COVID bailouts.
So guys, we're on version 3.5 of the bill. You know what hasn't been in there at all? We haven't had a mortgage freeze. We haven't had a rent freeze. We haven't had money for the states like they were saying. We haven't had universal basic income or recurring stimulus checks. So, according to Nancy Pelosi, www.shh.com, you're not allowed to criticize on the things that didn't make it in the bill. Of course I am. And I'm going to. But see, now the scariest part is this. Have you heard any of the lefties call her out on this? Now you could say, all right, well, whatever, give Bernie and Warren and Sherrod Brown and the nominal lefties in the Senate a pass because they're in the Senate. They're not in the House, and Nancy's in the House. Okay. Ro Khanna, Tulsi Gabbard, Ilhan Omar, AOC, Rashida Tlaib. Now, to be fair to Ilhan, she has been out there, pushing the ideas that I like, UBI, rent freeze. So she's been doing a decent job on that front. But one line they never, ever, ever cross, ever, is calling out the Democratic leaders by name and putting pressure on them specifically and saying, what are you doing? Harnessing the will of the people who they have on their side and saying, hey, everybody, I'm rallying the troops now. Call Nancy's office. Call Chuck Schumer's office. Tell them, here are our list of demands for the next bailout bill. We want a UBI. We want a rent freeze. We want a mortgage freeze. We want money for the states. We want universal testing. They don't do it. They don't do it.
Why don't they do it? We know why they don't do it. At least some of us do. Nancy and Chuck are powerful enough to hand all of the lefties their heads on a plate right now. I don't think Bernie or AOC or anyone else is going to take on Mama Bear Pelosi unless they have the political capital to get away with it. It's like us when we're considering going out on strike. We weigh the pros and we weigh the cons, and then we decide what to do based on our cost-benefit analysis. If the upside is better than the downside, we go for it. So let's say I think about my principles and I say, well, based on my principles, I need to go out on strike on May 1st, but nobody else is going to go out with me. What am I going to accomplish if I go out on strike by myself? I lose my ability to take care of my family, and I don't get anything. The cost-benefit analysis tells me I should probably not do it. Bernie and the squad, they could look at this and they could say, well, what do we get out of this versus what do we lose? It isn't simply a matter of courage, folks, and it isn't simply a matter of principles. When Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand, he meant that the demand had to be powerful enough to be an actual demand. And unless we give Bernie and the squad that power, they can't make that demand on our behalf.
We can expect to see more walkouts and protests leading up to big actions on May Day, or International Workers' Day, which is observed in most countries except the United States, despite its rich, militant, often bloody history of working-class struggle that secured major victories like the 8-hour workday. But May Day 2020 could see the reawakening of this more radical tradition in the U.S. as workers with Amazon, Target, Whole Foods, and other retailers are holding mass sick-outs and other protests to demand fair pay and workplace protections during the coronavirus pandemic.
The Amazon workers and the Whole Foods workers and the other slaves of Jeff Bezos are trying to tell us all what we all need to do. One of the primary concerns of these workers who are going out on strike is safety. But while we're here, why not combine those other issues that Kyle Kulinski was just mentioning? At the very least, after we get worker safety, we also should get monthly stimulus payments until this is over, if it ever is over, and we should get Medicare for all. Medicare for all is a huge bargaining chip because once workers have Medicare for all, their health care is not tied to their employment, and they can go out on strike with a lot more impunity. Single-payer Medicare for all is not negotiable. We have to have that. So if we go to all the trouble to go out on strike, we need to get at least that in return. So what did May Day used to look like? This is from Industrial Workers of the World, a union for all workers. IWW.org. This article by Eric Chase is entitled The Brief Origins of May Day. It was written in 1993, the same year that Joe Biden sexually assaulted Tara Reade. Most people living in the United States know little about the International Workers' Day of May Day. For many others, there is an assumption that it is a holiday celebrated in state communist countries like Cuba or the former Soviet Union. Most Americans don't realize that May Day has its origins here in this country and is as American as baseball and apple pie, and stemmed from the pre-Christian holiday of Beltane, a celebration of rebirth and fertility. In the late 19th century, the working class was in constant struggle to gain the 8-hour workday. Working conditions were severe, and it was quite common to work 10 to 16 hours a day in unsafe conditions. Ask truckers about that. Ask Amazon workers about that. Ask any warehouse workers about that. We're back to those conditions now. Truckers, I can tell you, work 10 to 16-hour days all the time, week after week. A lot of truckers put in 72-hour weeks. Death and injury were commonplace at many workplaces and inspired such books as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and Jack London's The Iron Heel. As early as the 1860s, working people agitated to shorten the workday without a cut in pay, but it wasn't until the late 1880s that organized labor was able to garner enough strength to declare the 8-hour workday. This proclamation was without consent of employers, yet demanded by many of the working class. Workers made the demand. At this time, socialism was a new and attractive idea to working people, many of whom were drawn to its ideology of working class control over the production and distribution of all goods and services. Workers had seen firsthand that capitalism benefited only their bosses, trading workers' lives for profit. Thousands of men, women, and children were dying needlessly every year in the workplace, with life expectancy as low as their early 20s in some industries, and little hope but death of rising out of their destitution. Socialism offered another option. A variety of socialist organizations sprang up throughout the later half of the 19th century, ranging from political parties to choir groups. In fact, many socialists were elected into governmental office by their constituency. But again, many of these socialists were hamstrung by the political process, which was so evidently controlled by big business and a bipartisan political machine. That sounds familiar. Tens of thousands of socialists broke ranks from their parties, rebuffed the entire political process, which was seen as nothing more than protection for the wealthy, and created anarchist groups throughout the country. Literally thousands of working people embraced the ideals of anarchism, which sought to put an end to all hierarchical structures, including government, emphasized worker-controlled industry, and valued direct action over the bureaucratic political process. It is inaccurate to say that labor unions were taken over by anarchists and socialists, but rather, anarchists and socialists made up the labor unions. All of these stories seem to end up in Chicago. At its national convention in Chicago, held in 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, which later became the American Federation of Labor, proclaimed that 8 hours shall constitute a legal day's labor from and after May 1st, 1886. The following year, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, FOTLU, backed by many Knights of Labor locals, reiterated their proclamation, stating that it would be supported by strikes and demonstrations. At first, most radicals and anarchists regarded this demand as too reformist, failing to strike at the root of the evil. A year before the Haymarket massacre, Samuel Fielden pointed out in the anarchist newspaper, The Alarm, that whether a man works 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, he is still a slave. This article intrigued me, so I did a little research on the Knights of Labor and the Haymarket affair. The Knights of Labor was an American labor federation active in the late 19th century, especially in the 1880s. It operated in the United States as well as in Canada, and had chapters also in Great Britain and Australia. Its most important leader was Terence V. Powderly. The Knights promoted the social and cultural uplift of the working man and demanded the 8-hour day. In some cases, it acted as a labor union negotiating with employers, but it was never well organized or funded. It was notable in its ambition to organize across lines of gender and race in the inclusion of both skilled and unskilled labor. After a rapid expansion in the mid-1880s, it suddenly lost its new members and became a small operation again. In 1869, Uriah Smith Stevens, James L. Wright, and a small group of Philadelphia tailors founded a secret organization known as the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor. The collapse of the National Labor Union in 1873 left a vacuum for workers looking for organization. The Knights became better organized with a national vision when they replaced Stevens with Terence V. Powderly. The body became popular with Pennsylvania coal miners during the economic depression of the mid-1870s when it grew rapidly. The KOL was a diverse industrial union open to all workers. The leaders felt that it was best to have a versatile population in order to get points of view from all aspects. The Knights of Labor barred 5 groups from membership: bankers, land speculators, lawyers, liquor dealers, and gamblers. Its members included low-skilled workers, railroad workers, immigrants, and steel workers. As membership expanded, the Knights began to function more as a labor union and less of a secret organization. During the 1880s, the Knights of Labor played a huge role in independent and third-party movements. Local assemblies began not only to emphasize cooperative enterprises, but to initiate strikes to win concessions from employers. The Knights of Labor brought together workers of different religions, races, and genders and helped them all create a bond and unify, all for the same cause. The new leader, Powderly, opposed strikes as a relic of barbarism, but the size and the diversity of the Knights afforded local assemblies a great deal of autonomy, which, as I've said before, is the way I think it should be. By 1886, the Knights had more than 700,000 members. The Knights' primary demand was for the 8-hour workday. They also called for legislation to end child and convict labor, as well as a graduated income tax. We still need to end convict labor. They also supported cooperatives. The only woman to hold office in the Knights of Labor, Leonora Berry, worked as an investigator. She described the horrific conditions in factories employing women and children. These reports made Berry the first person to collect national statistics on the American working woman. Haymarket Affair, also known as the Haymarket Massacre, Haymarket Riot, or Haymarket Square Riot, was the aftermath of a bombing that took place at a labor demonstration on May 4, 1886 at Haymarket Square in Chicago. It began as a peaceful rally in support of workers striking for an 8-hour workday, the day after police killed one and injured several workers. An unknown person threw a dynamite bomb at the police as they acted to dispense the meeting, and the bomb blast and ensuing gunfire resulted in the deaths of 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians. Dozens of others were wounded. No single event has influenced the history of labor in Illinois, the United States, and even the world more than the Chicago Haymarket Affair. It began with a rally on May 4, 1886, but the consequences are still being felt today. Although the rally is included in American history textbooks, very few present the event accurately or point out its significance. Despite the misgivings of many of the anarchists, an estimated 250,000 workers in the Chicago area became directly involved in the crusade to implement the 8-hour workday, including the Trades and Labor Assembly, the Socialist Labor Party, and local Knights of Labor. As more and more of the workforce mobilized against the employers, these radicals conceded to fight for the 8-hour day, realizing that the tide of opinion and determination of most wage workers was set in this direction. With the involvement of the anarchists, there seemed to be an infusion of greater issues than the 8-hour day. There grew a sense of a greater social revolution beyond the more immediate gains of shortened hours, but a drastic change in the economic structure of capitalism. In a proclamation printed just before May 1, 1886, one publisher appealed to working people with this plea: "Working men, to arms! War to the palace, peace to the cottage, and death to luxurious idleness. The wage system is the only cause of the world's misery. It is supported by the rich classes, and to destroy it they must be either made to work or die." 1 pound of dynamite is better than a bushel of ballots. Make your demand for 8 hours with weapons in your hands to meet the capitalistic bloodhounds, police, and militia in proper manner. Whoa. Not surprisingly, the entire city was prepared for mass bloodshed, reminiscent of the railroad strike a decade earlier when police and soldiers gunned down hundreds of striking workers. On May 1st, 1886, more than 300,000 workers in 13,000 businesses across the United States walked off their jobs in the first May Day celebration in history. In Chicago, the epicenter for the 8-hour day agitators, 40,000 went out on strike with the anarchists in the forefront of the public's eye. With their fiery speeches and revolutionary ideology of direct action, anarchists and anarchism became respected and embraced by the working people and despised by the capitalists. The names of many, Albert Parsons, Johann Most, August Spies, and Louis Ling, became household words in Chicago and throughout the country. Parades, bands, and tens of thousands of demonstrators in the streets exemplified the workers' strength and unity, yet didn't become violent as the newspapers and authorities predicted. More and more workers continued to walk off their jobs until the numbers swelled to nearly 100,000, yet peace prevailed. It was not until 2 days later, May 3, 1886, that violence broke out at the McCormick Reaper Works between police and strikers. For 6 months, armed Pinkerton agents and the police harassed and beat locked-out steelworkers as they picketed. Most of these workers belonged to the anarchist-dominated Metalworkers Union. During a speech near the McCormick plant, some 200 demonstrators joined the steelworkers on the picket line. Beatings with police clubs escalated into rock throwing by the strikers, which the police responded to with gunfire. At least 2 strikers were killed and an unknown number were wounded. Full of rage, a public meeting was called by some of the anarchists for the following day in Haymarket Square to discuss the police brutality. Due to bad weather and short notice, only about 3,000 of the tens of thousands of people showed up from the day before. This affair included families with children and the mayor of Chicago himself. Later, the mayor would testify that the crowd remained calm and orderly and that Speaker August Spies made no suggestion for immediate use of force or violence toward any person. As the speech wound down, 2 detectives rushed to the main body of police, reporting that a speaker was using inflammatory language, inciting the police to march on the speaker's wagon. As the police began to disperse the already thinning crowd, a bomb was thrown into the police ranks. No one knows who threw the bomb, but speculations varied from blaming any one of the anarchists to an agent provocateur working for the police. Enraged, the police fired into the crowd. The exact number of civilians killed or wounded was never determined, but an estimated 7 or 8 civilians died and up to 40 were wounded. 1 officer died immediately and another 7 died in the following weeks. Later evidence indicated that only 1 of the police deaths could be attributed to the bomb and that all the other police fatalities had or could have been due to their own indiscriminate gunfire. Aside from the bomb thrower, who was never identified, it was the police, not the anarchists, who perpetrated the violence. Today, we see tens of thousands of activists embracing the ideals of the Haymarket martyrs and those who established May Day as an International Workers' Day. Ironically, May Day is an official holiday in 66 countries and unofficially celebrated in many more, but rarely is it recognized in this country where it began. Over 100 years have passed since that first May Day. In the earlier part of the 20th century, the U.S. government tried to curb the celebration and further wipe it from the public's memory by establishing Law and Order Day on May 1st. We can draw many parallels between the events of 1886 and today. We still have locked-out steelworkers struggling for justice. We still have voices of freedom behind bars, as in the cases of Mumia Abu-Jamal and Leonard Peltier. We still had the ability to mobilize tens of thousands of people in the streets of a major city to proclaim, "This is what democracy looks like," at the WTO and the FTAA demonstrations. Words stronger than any I could write are engraved on the Haymarket Monument. The day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you are throttling today. Truly, history has a lot to teach us about the roots of our radicalism. When we remember that people were shot so we could have the 8-hour day, if we acknowledge that homes with families in them were burned to the ground so we could have Saturday as part of the weekend, when we recall 8-year-old victims of industrial accidents who marched in the streets protesting working conditions and child labor only to be beat down by the police and company thugs, we understand that our current condition cannot be taken for granted. People fought for the rights and dignities we enjoy today, and there is still a lot more to fight for. The sacrifices of so many people cannot be forgotten, or we'll end up fighting for those same gains all over again. This is why we celebrate May Day. Whether or not it's safe yet to pile into the streets, it is still safe to not go to work. It's safer not to go to work these days than it is to go to work. So as we weigh our own cost-benefit analyses, let's figure out whether we think it's worth it to go out on strike with Christian Smalls and the other workers who will be protesting on May 1st. We have a glorious and mostly nonviolent history that I think it would do us well to revive.